The garden is closed down, there's snow outside, and it's almost winter time, so what's the best thing to do when it's winter outside? Do winter squash. This year, as in all years, we do a lot of winter squash. And we do our three favorites, which is acorn squash, delicata, which is also known as sweet potato squash, and the all-time favorite butternut. The problem with some of these squash, now butternut, you can actually use a peeler to peel the skin. The winter squash skin is really hard. Now in the case of the butternut, it's nice and smooth. You can peel this off without much difficulty. But with the delicata and with the acorn squash, especially when you take a look at the acorn squash, you cannot peel this. This is going to be really hard to do. But to cook on them, piece of cake. You can almost treat them like a sweet potato. But we're going to freeze dry these. So we're going to wash them up and we're going to peel these. That's no problem. But with the delicata and with the acorn squash, what we're going to do, we're just going to slice them into 1-inch rings, put them on the freeze dry tray, freeze dry them, and then package them away. And then basically to reconstitute them, you just soak them in water, put them in the oven. It makes a nice little ring that you can put other food inside of to present it, and it has a really good taste. With the butternut, I love the butternut to make a puree. Goes well with steak. That's probably my favorite thing. So we're going to go ahead and process these and go on from there. So here we go. One other thing before we begin. Raising butternut squash will save you lots of money, especially on gym memberships. If you really want to get some good biceps, grow a bunch of butternut squash and you won't have to go to the gym. So we're going to start on this end, swing it over to this end, and cut off the ends when we're done. Here we go. Now, when you start doing the butternut squash, you'll see some green veins. You need to shave off enough to get rid of the green veins going through the flesh, so you have nothing but orange underneath. Voila, the butternut squash. So next thing I do, put it down, get your knife, line up the center of it, and go from top all the way to bottom. And it's kind of a pretty squash inside, kind of really interesting. Have this little cavity down here where all the seeds are. Get your handy spoon and spoon out all the seeds. Now it's time to slice it up. If you start from this end and slice out, by the time you get to this arch area and you try to cut it, it just makes it harder to cut. If you start at the arch end and go this way, I find it much easier. And the process continues. First up is going to be the delicata, or the sweet potato squash. Just going to cut off the ends. And about one, you can go anywhere from 1 to 1.5. If you get taller than that, it won't fit into the shelf of the freeze dryer. If you take a look at the insides of this, it has a nice shape, plenty of flesh around the outside. So we're just going to get a spoon and just run a spoon around the inside, take the seeds out, kind of clean it up, and that's pretty much it. They clean up pretty easy. The winter squash is one of those things that you really can't pile them up because, when you get to that high, it's going to hit the freeze dryer shelf. So just put them down and just go for it. There's really not any other way of doing it. And that's pretty much the same as the others. I'm going to cut off the ends. And cut it right down the side. And take out all the seeds. It almost looks like a canoe. Now the neat thing about the Delicata squash, you can actually, the skin on here is actually quite soft. You can eat the outside along with the inside. So I'm going to flip this upside down and I'm going to slice it into 1/2-inch slices. Now, one of the things I used to do when I was a kid, I used to roast pumpkin seeds, and these Delicata seeds, actually all these squash seeds, if you really wanted to, you could take these and roast them, put some seasoning on them, and you could eat them. More even the slices are, the better these will dry. If you have some that are 1/4 inch and some of a 1/2 inch, different thicknesses, it'll just take longer for the thick ones to freeze dry. The small ones will freeze dry just fine, but it takes longer for the thick ones to catch up. So I got a lot more squash ready to slice up, but this just gives you an idea on the Delicata squash. There are several methods to prepare an acorn squash. One is to do wedges, so you want to get a nice good grip on the acorn squash and just cut off just a little bit of the top side like that. That allows you to put it down and it won't move around too much. And then using your knife, you can come into the top, slice it in half. It's just like working with a pumpkin where you just cut out or scoop out all the seeds. Smells just like a pumpkin. Turn it over, you can cut it again, and one more time, and you can end up with wedges. And you can just freeze dry them in a wedge like this in your pan, which is just fine, and you can cook them, but when you eat it, you would just eat the meat, you wouldn't eat the skin. Acorn squash, of course, because it looks like an acorn. And as before, we're just going to clean up the seeds inside. So we have Delicata, sweet potato squash, and acorn squash. I have a different way of doing it. This is how my wife likes to do her winter squash. I like to make slices, so we'll do this style, we'll do the slice style, but any way you cut it, it's winter squash, and there's all sorts of things you can do with winter squash. It's a great side dish. A method to remove the meat from an acorn squash or any other squash that has a rough exterior is I can take a paring knife and I can insert it through the center, and the first cut will remove and eject all the seeds like that. So all the seeds are gone. And I can come back here, and the reason I'm wearing this glove, this is my kitchen glove, which is a clean glove. I can then cut of acorn squash going all the way around using my thumb as a guide, and I can just take out the meat right here and leave the rind behind. This is the way I prefer doing my squash. So I have 2 trays of butternut, 1 of acorn, and 1 of Delicata. So this is going to be the first load that's going to go in my freeze dryer, and there's more to come. I am making dinner tonight. We're having sous vide ribeye steak, baked potatoes, and winter squash. I have 2 different types of squash here. And this is squash I freeze dried back in December, and now it's January. So I have some acorn squash that is sliced up, and then I have some butternut squash that is basically cubed. So we're going to have both these squashes together. The acorn squash I'm going to use like as a little bowl to put the butternut squash in. And these squashes have been in my freeze-dried pantry, and this is something I can pull from when I need to. So we're going to go ahead and rehydrate these. I'm going to use a couple of these to hold the squash, 2 of the larger size ones. And for something that's been in my pantry for about a month and a half, they're still very dry. So we're going to use these 2 acorn squash and some of the butternut. So we're going to go ahead and rehydrate these and see how they come out and make the vegetable part of the meal. So I have 2 bowls of hot water, and we're going to take the acorn squash and put it in this one. It's quite buoyant, so we're going to have to kind of keep an eye on that. And then for the butternut squash, put a couple of handfuls or so in this one. And we'll go ahead and rehydrate these. And put these aside for 10-15 minutes or so. Okay, so the squash is fairly restored here, but you got to remember this is still raw. This has come out to be really nice. We're going to go ahead and set this aside. I'm going to take this squash and some aluminum foil and put all this in the center, and we're going to throw this in the oven along with our baked potatoes to cook and soften. And we'll come back to this in probably about half an hour. And the acorn squash are also going to go in the oven, and these have come back really well. So these are going to be wrapped up along with the butternut squash. Like so. So I have here our butternut squash that has been in the oven, and we're going to go ahead and transfer this to the bowl. And I really don't have proportions per se, but we're going to go and add a little bit of butter. This is pretty much just a season to taste. So this is probably about an 1/8 cup of butter. And we're going to put about the same amount, an 1/8 cup of brown sugar in here. You can probably see where I'm going with this. And we're going to put some pecans in there also. And we're going to smash this up just like as if it was like potatoes. And a little bit of salt. A little bit more butter. And a little bit more brown sugar. A little bit more pecans. A little bit more salt. Put that aside. The next part is the acorn squash. And this is now cooked. Just flip this over. And we're going to go ahead and just give that a little bit of salt for the acorn squash. And we're going to go ahead and take this butternut puree, and we're going to put it in the middle of the acorn squash. So we actually have two different winter squashes joined together. I guess you could almost say this is stuffed acorn squash. I'm going to go ahead and put this back in the oven, exposed, open, to finish it off. And then we'll put this on the plate along with the steak and baked potato. Here's the ribeyes. And this is our winter squash, which is a combination of acorn and butternut. So this is going to be dinner for the night. I think it's going to be a pretty darn good dinner. So I hope this has given you some ideas on what you can do with winter squash. It's a great thing to have in the off season, and winter squash, if you do it right, will pretty much last you several months into the colder weather. I'd like to thank you for your time. I appreciate your comments. Please subscribe. And until we meet again, bon appetit.